Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with David Rogers, who, in addition to being a instructor at Columbia Business School and the founder of David Rogers Group, and the author of a couple books. This one, the Digital Transformation Playbook from, I guess, nearly a decade ago, and this new book called The Digital Transformation Roadmap, Rebuild Your Organization for Continuous Change. I was going to say that you are like the digital transformation OG, and I thought I was going to be very clever. And then I looked on your LinkedIn page, and it actually says David, Digital Transformation OG. So I get 0 points for creativity there.
You weren't the first person to say it, and I heard it a couple of times. I was like, hey, I don't know, maybe I was talking to my, my content marketing, consultant. She said, yeah, that's good. Always mixing things up. Let's throw that on the LinkedIn. It's only been on the LinkedIn page a couple of weeks. So yes, it was, I don't know, in the air. But yeah. So it's thanks so much for having me on the program, Greg. Really enjoy the conversations you have and the sort of, you live up to the name of the podcast, Unsiloed, in terms of, bringing together different topics. But I've been digging this. I mean, I've written 5 books, 3 as a solo author, but I kind of really hit on this topic.
Your background was, you had marketing really was your background before you got into this, right?
Yeah. I mean, I started as a jazz saxophonist and a composer. So we all have circuitous paths through our lives. But I really came to academia and business and looking at that kind of intersection of technology and business and organizations. Kind of from a marketing and sort of customer experience background, research center I was at, helped start at Columbia about 25 years ago. But what I found early on was it was interesting as digital change and sort of new business models and new interaction models were sort of really starting to touch existing businesses. Obviously, there were certain industries that got hit first, media, for example, but also there were certain functions that kind of picked it up. And marketers, as they're doing their job, they're supposed to be the most sort of customer-facing people in the organization. So they tended to pick it up. And there was this kind of misperception that this was a marketing challenge. It was like digital for a while was always followed with the word marketing, like, oh, digital marketing. And that was never really my perception. It was always that this was changing sort of business strategy but the relationships of kind of businesses to or organizations to their customers. That was an earlier book of mine, The Network is Your Customer. So that just got me into, but I kind of recognized from very early on, this was really not about things like advertising. It was not even really just about things like brands and customer experiences and sort of that interface solely between the customer and the business, but also, inside the nodes of the network inside your organization, for example.
Yeah, I mean, look, these 2 books, this one, I think in many ways is a sequel to the original book, and it kind of captures a lot of the lessons that you've learned over the years trying to help these companies to implement, right, what you put into this book. And, you might think when you have a title like this, that this is going to be something that's going to age very quickly, right? Because it's going to be tied to the specific technologies of the day, right? And so, of course, the technologies that companies were grappling with in 2016 are a lot different from the ones they're grappling with today. And so, you might think you need an entirely new playbook. I mean, this book is really more, it's really about more than the technology specifically. In fact, I think you make this point repeatedly, and I have to make this point all the time when I'm dealing with companies who are looking for some solution, right? They come to Silicon Valley. I'm sure, they come to New York for the same reasons, right? And they're like, hey, we just need to know, like, which technologies do we have to bolt on to our existing business, right? It's like, you're missing the whole point, right? That it's all about the business.
In the first of the 2 of the diptych, the 2 books, the Digital Transformation Playbook. So again, context, that was, published 10 years ago. So obviously written 12 years ago, based on research and observations going back 15 plus years and worked with companies and so forth. But that was the historical moment that it came out. Fortunately, it wasn't my first book. So I know I know to write books that are not looking at, the issue of the day, so to speak. But Yeah, I was looking at the more kind of underlying issues, and it's funny. I wrote, when you write a book, it's typically you write the introduction is actually the last thing you write. Usually, chapter 1, 2, you sort of completely rewrite it after you finish the whole book. But so the very last thing I was writing was the introduction, and I kind of was, trying to kind of tie together a few thoughts to kind of the basis of the whole book. And one of the sentences I wrote on the very first or second page was, "Digital transformation is not about technology." And I sort of explained a little bit why, and then the kind of whole book argues that, or sort of lays that. It doesn't even argue it, it just sort of illustrates it, because it looks at the challenge as not really a challenge of what technology to bolt on, as you said, whatsoever. But actually, how do we reimagine? It's really a book about sort of strategic imagination. How do we escape the blind spots of being trapped from the historical past and past successes of our business? And this is sort of particularly, common in established businesses, because you don't get to be an established business that's been around for decades and has tens of thousands of people unless you've had success. And so that success will inevitably, if you're not careful, have a tendency cognitively to blind you and create sort of, shutters around your view of the world. So that's kind of what that whole book was focused on. And I was very surprised when I went out and started, it was actually the first book written on digital transformation. So I learned.
Now I've got a whole bookshelf full of books on the topic.
Yeah, and it was like a little micro genre. I mean, I learned the difference between writing a book that you're proud of and pulls together ideas in a focused and hopefully helpful way, versus doing that and having like really good timing. So, of course, the timing was kind of perfect. The first book on the topic, it kind of blew up, helped to sort of set the agenda, I think, for other things that came afterwards. But I was so surprised when I started traveling the world talking about the book that the one slide everyone took pictures of was a slide where I said digital transformation is not about technology. It was just meant to be kind of an introductory, prefatory slide to get the conversation going. And everyone was like, whoa, my mind is blown. And I realized that was a message that really, a lot of organizations need to hear.
Yeah, I mean, we might need to drop the title, because I find that, when we were talking about digital transformation 10 years ago, we were typically talking about, what we all agree on are legacy companies, right? So, you talk about New York Times, you talk about, John Deere, you talk about Procter & Gamble and so forth. But, when I talk about digital transformation now, I mean, I'm just as likely to include companies like Oracle or Microsoft or, Amazon or Autodesk, right? Because these Google, recently their, implementation of Gemini to catch up with OpenAI. I mean, that itself is, I guess, something we'd call a digital transformation. So it's for everybody now.
Yes, I wouldn't say for everybody. But what I would distinguish is where I would frame who is this. Let me put it this way: who this is particularly important or critical to or resonant for. I used to actually, when I wrote the playbook, the blue book, number 1, and the roadmap is number 2. So when I wrote the first one, the playbook, I sort of described it as companies that started before the internet, because that was kind of at that moment you saw this sort of real stark divide between companies that had an established business model and operating model and customers and products and so forth before really the commercial internet took off in the in the mid 90s versus those that came after, because they sort of had different orientation. But what I started seeing was in the years after that book was whether it was an executive program at Columbia or a company reaching out to me to come in as an advisor with my consulting group, that I started, still most of my clients were of that type, but I started to get asked for help from companies that had started, after 95, after 2000, companies that were digital from their very first start in terms of their business model. And yet they said, no, we're struggling with these same challenges of like, how do we keep up with change? How do we be, as Google, how do we respond as this established, behemoth to OpenAI and this new disruptive, business model?
Or even,
the
move from on-prem to cloud. I mean, this, a lot of these companies were post-internet. It's just that they were designed for the old internet, right?
So what I realized is the real distinction is companies that have reached a certain scale. It is still a different set of problems. I mean, strategy is strategy, culture is culture. This thing's obviously common for any size organization. But between if you're a startup or really if you are even, I guess what I learned after the playbook was this was all about primarily how do you rethink your strategic mindset, spot the growth opportunity, not be held back by where you've been. But what I learned was even the companies who were able to do what most did not, and make that imaginative leap, see where the market and customer opportunities were going and so forth, and start to think about a new strategy. If you were a company of, 500 people, single line of business, right? Maybe a single geography. Basically, these are the factors that make relatively lower organizational complexity. Those kind of organizations could pivot. They could make the shift. They could say, this is the new strategy. We're doubling down. We're growing into this. And as organizations and companies get more complex, which is the biggest kind of markers are number of employees, number of distinct business units that serve different markets, different geographies, which bring different regulatory regimes as well as other, sort of areas of complexity. Those organizations, even when they recognize, we've got to make a shift. The market's going this way. This is the new trend. This is the new competitors, the asymmetric competition we're facing. They just found it very hard to actually get it to take hold, to implement across, there's like all these layers of sort of stasis and, bureaucracy and silos and so forth. And we can talk about it different ways, but there were organizational kind of inertia in place. And so that's how I tend to talk about it more now, is a lot of these principles are about how, as you get to scale, how can you still maintain some of that agility, that ability to respond to change and pivot and eat your own, current revenue to invest in the future revenue, and take smart risks and make really bets on highly unknown things, even though you are a large company or a well-established, big complex organization. And we're seeing that can be done. It is not easy. And that's really what led me to the whole, book. The latest book, The Roadmap, was understanding what does it take to make that happen, to really sort of reinvent the organization to be ready for continuous, constant change. And that's the real meaning of digital to me today. Digital is not about the technology inside your company. It's not even about somewhat the behaviors of the market and customers, but it's really more the context we are in, which is one of not a change that happened in 1994 to 96, or some other change. The shift to mobile. The shift to this, the shift to the cloud. It's just one after another. And each wave of technology change is catalyzing the next. It's not sort of just, why are they each coming? Well, each one is building on the one that was right before it. And so we are dealing with this pace of change and level of uncertainty, therefore, in your context, for any organization that is kind of unprecedented, and certainly not what big organizations were built for and organized for in the 20th century.
Yeah, it seems like managers have imbibed sort of an equilibrium thinking, the kind of stuff that we do in economics. I mean, I'm not sure exactly why, but the notion that, you have a way of doing things, and then there's, a shock, and the shock, forces you to change, and then you settle into a new way of doing things.
There's some new plateau.
Right? Exactly.
Right? The new normal.
Right.
There's no new normal anymore, right? There's no plateau. Exactly. And that's another way I've talked about it. It's like we realize the digital era is not like this big shock happened from whatever year to whatever year, 94 to 97. 94 to 2008 or something. And now we got to kind of reorient, and then, we're going to be good again. We can go back to silos and functional organizational architecture and planning oriented processes and maximum control from the top down. That's not happening.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this has been a question that goes all the way back to Schumpeter, right? Which is, why do we even need new companies in the first place? Because if you're an incumbent, you have all these advantages, right? I mean, you have a customer base, and you have employees, and you have intellectual property, and you have a trademark, and you have all this stuff. And then some startup comes along with none of those advantages, and they just, they wipe you out. Why? and it's a mystery. Why didn't these incumbents just do it on their own?
The challenge is all of those advantages can very easily and do very easily become liabilities. They hold you back in times of change, right? So you're really well set up in a static environment. And that's what our planning models, the sort of traditional kind of early, mid-20th century theories of management, how do we build organizations at scale, were all based around relatively static environment. Yes, change, but how do we replicate things? How do we maximize control? Consistency was kind of the through line of managerial practice. And that is not the top priority, right? There's always trade-offs in any organizational approach, but prioritizing consistency and control and deprioritizing the ability to respond to change is really not a winning play anymore. Even in industries where it seemed like they would change last, because, well, there's higher risks to, you're regulated or you're in a life and death kind of industry and so forth. Well, we should stick with an old top-down managerial model. They're just failing, whether you're looking automotive, you're looking at traditional military bureaucracies, you're looking at, healthcare. We still see the same need for this real reinvention in how we approach innovation and change and dynamism, because you can actually, as you said, turn those things to advantages as the legacy player, as the incumbent, right? They can be advantages. You've got to look to the fact you're never going to be as agile. I'm sorry. There's no way if you're 50,000 people and you've got you're a public company and you've got different stakeholders as a result who have a different risk appetite. You're never going to be as agile as that startup in your own space. You can get much closer to them. And then if you can, and agility, and then if you can leverage the fact that you have the customer base they wish they had, you have the historical data sets that they wish they had, you have the partner network which they are aspiring to build, then you've got a chance to answer Schumpeter's question and say, hey, maybe we can do this ourselves.
Well, I mean, you quote this statistic, and it's not, you're not the only one. I think, BCG, McKinsey, Deloitte, they'll all give you some number like this. 70% of these digital transformation initiatives have, failed to meet expectations. And, when you hear that, I mean, okay, fine. If that was the case in 2016 or maybe in 1999, I think we'd be okay with that. But I mean, it's now 10 years later, there's this book, available for $20, right? And there's tons of other books and there's lots of insight about this. I mean, why is it that we still see these numbers? I mean, is it just that we are moving the, goalpost and becoming more ambitious, or is this an iron law of failure? I mean, how do we explain the failure to learn from, what folks like yourself have been writing about all these years?
So I guess I could answer that in a couple ways. That was the project of the latest book, was to answer that question. So doing the research, looking at the many cases of digital transformations which have not really sort of paid off, right? And I always put they failed in quotes, because some of those most spectacular failures at one point in time, you look at that same organization a few years later, and actually they're an example of a digital transformation success.
Yeah, like New York Times is a great example.
That's why I opened the book with that example, because you see both. You see they did everything wrong, every classic mistake. They're such a great teaching case because they did all the classic mistakes. And then they were able to actually reach a point of crisis and say, hey, you know what? We can't keep going on. They had that kind of, the scales fell from the eyes moment, and everyone sort of realized it was untenable. And then they started doing the right things. So they started with that clear vision from the top leadership of directionally, what do we actually need to solve for here? Where are we going? They picked some strategic priorities to really focus on, to give clarity, and no longer just shooting in 100 different directions. It wasn't just about technology projects. It's about solving critical business issues. They started to change, learn how to operate with a kind of a different operating model, and how to put together cross-functional teams and innovate and experiment and kind of rapidly test ideas, and with the humility and the assumption that most of them wouldn't work. So all these pieces started to come together. So I would start by sort of pointing that out. But why do so many of these organizations struggle? I mean, the first kind of lesson, the first step of the kind of the framework in that book, what I call the roadmap, which is really just, what did I discover? Did all these, you can say 70% are failing. To me, I'm a glass half full kind of guy. So I get excited. I'm like, wow, that means 30% are succeeding.
Now,
30%
technically, that's not half, just saying.
Yeah. So I'm saying I'm an extra optimist. I'm still optimistic about that. I'm like, that's a lot of companies we can learn from at this point, right? Because you've got a big sample size. So that was kind of what drove the research, was let's find out what these companies like the New York Times and John Deere and Air Liquide and MasterCard and different sectors and around the world and so forth, what are they all doing right, so to speak? One of the things, and this is one of the things that is, critical, I sort of start the book with, is having a what I call a shared vision. So a lot of companies, I find, they're spending money, they have people appointed to be in charge of digital transformation, and yet one-on-one, the CEOs will confess to me if I ask them. I say, what do you think people in your organization believe that digital transformation means for your particular company? Now, it's a generic, but what's that mean for us? And they say, honestly, if you talk to 3 different people, I think you'll get 3 different answers.
Well, is that because the CEOs don't know, or is it they just don't know how to communicate it?
I would say mostly that they don't know. You need both, right? You need to know it and you need to communicate it. But I think the problem is more the former than the latter. So really having a clear sense, and this is more than just sort of where do we see our industry going? Of course you need that, right? What I call a future landscape. But you've also got to have a point of view of what is our right to win in that digital future that we see emerging, right? What are our unique advantages? Not a guarantee of success whatsoever, but what are the things that give us a particular role, or at least that particular opportunity to succeed in that very different future that we see hurtling towards us, right? And then getting some clarity of what is the impact we are seeking to have, right? Collectively, out of all these transformation efforts. At the end of the day, how is this going to change the lives of the people or the businesses or the, organizations or that we serve, but also what I call our business theory, right? How do we believe that these investments are going to pay for themselves? Because a lot of people just sort of treat it as like a cost center. It's like, well, we know we've got to be digital is the thing, and we don't want to be behind our competitors. And they have this total kind of backward thinking as sort of the motivation or the rationale for why digital matters. So, I would say that's sort of one answer. But I think another way of thinking about this is I've seen a lot of organizations embark on some kind of digital transformation effort with a misconception of what actually they're trying to do, like a category error. So I kind of try to stress this, I think also in the introduction of the book, that kind of these 3 misconceptions that I see. One, I already stated, digital transformation is not about technology. And I say that because many organizations do. They do believe this is about, we're going to upgrade our technology. We're going to digitize our core business. We're going to we're going in for the facelift and the, retune at the auto shop and so forth.
And that's just table stakes. That's the thing.
It's just table stakes.
You got to do it. You can't not do it.
But you also really shouldn't do it until you get the clarity of the strategy, because there's not some generic set. Yes, there are common principles, but there's not a generic set of these are the things you need to spend money on and in what order and what priority for every organization. So you've got to get that kind of clear even before. But that's the first mistake, thinking it's about technology. Another, digital transformation is not a project that has an end date, right? Many times CEOs come to me and say, okay, I believe it. I read your book. We're going to do this thing.
Gantt chart. Let's get the Gantt chart out.
Yeah, get the Gantt chart. Is this 3 years or 4 years, Rogers? And what's the rough budget we need to set aside for this? This is not a project in that sense. It is ongoing. It's not going to stop because the change is not going to stop. It's about becoming a more adaptive organization. It's not about completing a series of sort of tasks or activities. And then the third is that for transformation to really work and really pay off and really start to see the kind of results at scale that really change, hey, how do we operate? Where do we make our money? Who's our competition? What's the, prospects of the future of this business? It's not just some pilot projects. For that level of change to really happen, the change cannot be just top down. Yes, leaders have a critical role, but for it to really take hold, it has to become bottom-up change as well. And you've got to lead in a way that you are giving that clarity of vision and alignment and what are the problems we're trying to solve for. And then people at every level of the organization and every function of the organization are themselves pushing the change forward and coming up with the ideas, spotting the opportunities, saying, here's what I think we should or could be doing differently in my particular neighborhood of this large organization. That's where you start to see the real transformational ways organizations operate.
Now, is there some tension between those objectives? I mean, I just got through doing a digital transformation initiative with a telco, and very legacy, lots of old processes and so forth. And it seems like the top down having some notion of, okay, what is this company going to do, right? And having a definition on what the company's going to do is a bit inconsistent with the idea of let's crowdsource ideas about kind of what we're going to do. And so a lot of people would say that, organizational design is the new strategy, right? In other words, if you design your organization in a way that it is capable of learning and experimenting, then it will ultimately kind of migrate to what it is going to do, right? But it's very difficult to know ahead of time, right? And so because the typical definition of strategy is like, what do we do? What do we don't do, right?
Yeah. So that's not my definition of strategy. And also, I would say, I want to be clear, my definition when I talk about a bottom-up organization, it's not about putting all the control in the hands of the people at the bottom of the pyramid, so to speak. This is about having an organization that is bringing in ideas from throughout the organization and also from outside the organization. Is that kind of porous organization. And it is one where change is beginning at every level of the organization, right? And where leaders are seeking to push decision-making down. Leaders seek to push every decision down to the lowest level of the organization possible, right? Great leaders, and you see this in really the most admired and most successful digital native kind of businesses that have grown to scale. Great leaders pride themselves on how few decisions they make. Now, it's not that leaders don't make decisions, right? The CEO does not make zero decisions and, everything's just going to be crowdsourced. But the point is you try to make as few as possible. You say, what are the decisions that truly need to be made at my level? And whenever you see a decision, you ask yourself, could we push this down to someone who is closer to that particular problem, right? It's actually at the level of the business that they're running and give them more ownership and autonomy and authority over it. So it's not a one or the other. This is not, I know you were talking about binaries on a recent episode of yours that I was listening to. This is about escaping that binary that it's like, either the top is kind of deciding strategy and telling everyone what to do, cascading down, you hear the principle, or it's like a big, crowdsourcing experiment where, everyone decides. And that's why I don't think you sort of, let's change the organizational structure to be more decentralized or something like that. And there may be elements of that I would definitely argue for, but sort of let's do that and then it'll figure out the strategy for us. No, you do need the people who have the view of the whole organization to be asking some of the strategic questions that are about the whole, the holistic questions, how do the parts all fit together and things like that. But they shouldn't be making other decisions or dictating other elements of strategy about each level of the organization.
Yeah, and I was talking to the CEO of this company, and he was saying, he's brand new to the organization. He said, I have about 10,000 people asking me every week, for permission to do stuff. It's all, they want me to sign off on all this stuff, and he's like, this is nuts, and it's like, yeah, these people are doing that because in the past, presumably,
if
they took an initiative and it failed and they, got penalized. And so I think you have a great quote in there, which is, I forget who you quoted. It's a famous quote. You can't keep expecting A, right, when you're rewarding for B, right? And so you need to change the incentives there.
Absolutely. And that's where organizational design is really important. I mean, people will respond to the barriers you place around them, the rewards, the incentives, negative and positive, right? And it's not just financial. Of course, that's a powerful lever. But what are the things you get recognized for and, spotlighted for and applauded for? What are the things you get chastised for, right? Even if you don't actually lose your job. But those things have a tremendous impact on reinforcing or dissuading certain behaviors. And so, yeah, I talk a lot about that kind of through the book, and then particularly bring it back again at the conclusion, is about really effective leaders. What I see, their role, they realize, is much less. It is primarily not about deciding things at all, which is ultimately what a permission, a machine is about. All these people requesting permissions. That means they believe your role as a leader is to make the ultimate decision, that the go, no go on 10,000 things a day. And effective leaders do not orient their job around making decisions primarily, right? What they're primarily trying to do is to define what truly matters, right? To then communicate that to others, right? To achieve that kind of alignment and clarity that we're kind of pulling in the same direction. And then to empower others, right? To enable the rest of the organization to do it. So not looking over your shoulder to say, hey, are you following the game plan? But instead, the default conversation of leaders should be, what's holding you back? Yeah, what are you working on? And what's getting in the way? What's slowing you down? What's the hurdle? What's the roadblock? And this is something that I saw in exceptional organizations was really good leaders. That's what a lot of their job is. They're just going around removing impediments to the people below them so that they can get on with doing the good work that needs to be done.
There was a story about this Viking funeral for failed, for terminated projects. I love that idea. Right? That's cool. Who's doing that?
That was at Ford Motors. That was Jim Hackett, I believe, when he was CEO. He brought that in. Yeah, I mean, you do have to. I talk in the chapter that gets into culture and some of these things, I talk about the power of kind of stories and symbols, right? And that is part of communication. Communication is not just kind of having the same bullet point PowerPoint and giving it over and over and over as a leader.
So, who was it that said that no one's ever motivated by numbers, only by stories?
Yeah, that was, I believe, Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winning psychologist, right? No one has ever made a decision because of a number. They need a story. And that's so great, particularly because the way that data and decisions have been welded, kind of fused together as two words. And again, it's not really, I would say, when we say data-driven decision-making, to me, it's data-informed decision-making. It's a subtle thing. The data is not making the decision. You are making the decision. It's a process of defining in advance, what's the data that I would like that would help me make this decision? Not expect the data to give you any kind of perfect knowledge or 100% forecast, but this is the data that would really sort of help me inform making this. But Kahneman's point is, hey, if you really want to communicate this to people, you got to, put aside the data. What really resonates, what clicks, which helps people, and I've learned this as an author too, is you've got to wed your ideas to stories. So I do talk about that in terms of how effective how leaders who communicate effectively use stories and symbols. And that's what that Viking funeral was. Another great example I've written about that I love was Sunil Sinha as one of the senior executives at Tata, the global conglomerate. And he, the year he reinvented their innovation prizes. So they had these already established, because they've got about 100 different companies in the operating group. So they all compete every year. There's they had a category, best probably product innovation, best supply chain innovation, best service innovation, and so forth. And he decided to introduce one for the best failure, right? Or the best innovation that got the plug pulled on it, so to speak. He gave it a nice little name, the Dare to Try Award. But it was very explicit. It was like, this has to be something that was shut down, right? Otherwise, you don't even qualify. And then articulated their criteria. And I talk a lot in my writing about what, in the context of organization, a learning organization, what is smart failure, right? Failure is inevitable. What you want to change is the cost of failure and the benefits of failure rather than the rate of failure. The rate of failure is pretty much outside of your control. And so he said, we're going to have an award where it's for the best failure. And of course, not very, 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 very few people applied for it the first year. I was like, who really wants to apply? Get that on your resume. I had the best failure. But, they beat the bushes and, encouraged and got a handful of teams from across the entire giant company to submit. And they reviewed it on their criteria, which, I think were things like, it was an important strategic problem to pursue. And they didn't waste resources. It was effectively managed and they shut it down at the right time. They got some learning from it and shared it with others. Some of the classic principles of SMART, or sometimes called intelligent failure. And then the key thing was, kind of like the Viking funeral, it's about the ceremony, right? They had the big event, the big show, where they gave out the awards for the most awesome innovations of the year. And these things had made like a big impact on the bottom line or brought on all these customers, and it just sounds great. Everybody feels good. And then they brought up the winner of the Dare to Try award. And he spent just as much time heaping praise on them, saying what we all should learn from this team and why we should all strive to be like them. And that was like, whoa, that really started to shift people's thinking. And within a couple of years, they found they were getting as many teams applying for that award as for the others. And they also saw that the teams or the business units that tended to win the Best Failure Award, the Dare to Try, often were also very likely to win, obviously on a different project, one of the innovation success awards, right? Because if you're good at failing, your ultimately your success or the impacts of your success is going to be much higher and greater. So that's the kind of thing leaders do have to think about communication and think about what really resonates with people, stories, symbols, these kind of rituals, if you will. That is part of how you start to really bring along people's thinking. And then again, the whole point is they will drive the change forward.
Right. And of course, symbols and stories and communication, it seems like that's more important in a world where, you're navigating uncertainty, right? Because if it's obvious, you're selling detergent and, you've been selling the same detergent for 50 years, like, you don't really need to explain what's going on. It's fairly straightforward, right?
You build a model, you define your KPIs, you hold people accountable. Look, I talk about the importance of aligning people in the organization and had this vision and so forth. But I try to be clear in the book and when I'm working with leaders, honestly, you don't really need that. This whole we should all know our North Star and what we're trying to achieve and so forth, if you're following the old management model. People might feel a little better. You might have a little better employee morale if they feel there's some great purpose we're all achieving or what we're all into. But honestly, you're just holding them accountable to a KPI. It's like, well, here's a spreadsheet. Here are the numbers you got to hit each quarter. Here's what you got to hit each week. Alignment and clarity and vision and so forth are kind of, it's just kind of a little whipped cream on the dessert. It's not really essential. But if you want an organization that is capable of bottom-up change, that is capable of moving much more quickly because everyone isn't waiting for those 10,000 permissions to be signed off by the CEO, that you have more distributed decision-making in the organization, that will not work unless you have that alignment and that clarity. That's why the leader's job has to be different.
I think you also quoted somebody who said, nothing's so practical as a good theory. And so, a theory is a model is sort of a type of story. It's one that, requires a little bit more, I guess, sophistication. But, a lot of my MBA students wonder why do we need to, learn about theory? Why do we need to learn about, frameworks and, so forth. And, it really is incredibly helpful in guiding you, particularly in times of uncertainty.
It is. And that's the goal of a theory is it is a tool or it's a enabler for the mind, right? It enables you to think through ambiguity, think through when it is not clear, when you can't just ask the algorithm to crunch the number and tell you what to do next and how much to spend on which SEO word in your ad campaigns, right? There are things you can do that way. But when you're dealing with ambiguity and where there's not a clear right answer, when you're dealing with the more important questions, the things that really wind up adding or subtracting, creating or destroying value for the business and for your customers, you can't make those decisions that way. And that's where theories become really helpful. And I actually talk about strategy is a theory. This is one of the things you mentioned a definition of strategy before. And I said, that's not how I would think of strategy at all. To me, strategy is really about asking two questions. And this is something I came across many years ago. Because strategy you'll hear in different kind of contexts. And people are really talking about something specific like competitive strategy or Michael Porter. They're talking about, marketing positioning or something. But strategy writ large in any kind of various contexts, what it really means, I believe, is asking two questions. The first is, what are we trying to achieve? And the second is, how do we believe we might achieve that?
Yeah, what are we good at?
And that's the theory, right? So a lot of, I go into meetings where I'm trying to get teams to define, what's the strategy in terms of like specific problem to solve or an opportunity. And they'll start with things like, our strategy is to grow our, raise our ROI by, 10% this year, or improve our market share, right? ROI is not a strategy, right?
Or become more digital. We're going to try and become more digital.
Become more digital. Like what? So you've got to figure out not just what are you trying to achieve and something more meaningful than that, but the theory is what could get us there. What do we believe might get us there? We believe, we know we need to increase our customer retention. And based on what we've learned so far, we believe that part of why our retention is low is because a lot of new customers can't sufficiently figure out how to use our service or our product. They're not getting as much value out of it as they could. And so they get frustrated. And so they unsubscribe, right? You're a SaaS company. That's a real, company I had advised. So that is a theory, right? And once you have that theory, now you can act on it. You can say, okay, let's see if that's true. Let's see if we can make a difference in A, does it in fact have an impact in B? So strategy is all about theory formulation at a very often granular level, right? The very specific, part of the business that you're in. It is not something that is done by people with strategy in the title of their job who sit, in a special team at headquarters and produce a document once a year or once a quarter. Strategy is something you need to embed in every level of the organization as a thinking discipline, which is about defining, again, what are we trying to achieve? What do we believe is a way or the best way to achieve that at this point in time?
Well, look, one of the big questions that always comes up in organizational change is the extent to which you want to sort of separate the explore and exploit functions, right? And, oftentimes organizations will create a chief digital officer and they'll say, okay, like your job, or they'll create a separate division. One of the cases that I use in my strategy classes, the BMG case, right, where they created, BMG.com, okay, and do we create a division, throw it out there in San Francisco, let all the people who, bring their dogs to the office and wear flip-flops and so forth, and let them handle all of our digital business while all the grown-ups back in Armonk or whatever, manage the mature business. I mean, to what extent does that accelerate things, and to what extent does that
completely fails? So this is another one of those dichotomies that has just caused so much trouble in reality as people try to implement it. That completely fails. So this is what I've seen in so many organizations. This is one of the real discoveries that just led to a lot of kind of the digging in that developed into the roadmap, the latest.
New York Times is, of course, one of the examples in the book that they did this.
Yeah. I mean, but lots of industrial companies, all sorts of businesses who had this idea. And yes, explore and exploit it's a useful framework to ask the question of what are different things we need to be doing. But it led far too easily in practice, in the hands of practitioners, into this belief that that's an organizational model. And so you should have the people who explore, the people who exploit, meaning you've got certain people who run the core business as it is, and other people who are out there on the cutting edge trying to figure out innovation, new opportunities, and so forth. And this led to different models under different names. There became a whole term in the banking industry: run the bank, change the bank, and Challenger, and I forget the mothership and the battleship and the speedboats. And there are all these metaphors about that you got to have these two things in your organization. So here's where and why that fails. You are aligning different things that don't necessarily go together, which is a question of what I call proximity, which has to do with, are we looking at the core business as it is? Are we trying to make change or solve a problem there, versus things that are maybe, in some cases, we want to look outside of what our core business has been to date and identify some new opportunities, right? And then the other question is, how much uncertainty are we dealing with? Is this something where the problem is quite well defined? We've got a lot of examples. We've got a lot of benchmark data of how others have, like if you're now trying to move to the cloud for the first time in an established industry, the cloud providers can just roll out reams of data of like, here's 10 companies in your exact industry, your size, and how we did it, and what, how we sequenced it, and what needed to be done. There are problems that are relatively well defined, and there are lots of problems that are not. right? Where there's a lot more uncertainty. We want to change the user experience of our banking, app or something like that. Anytime you're dealing with human factors, you've got all kinds of complexity and uncertainty. And those two dimensions do not go together, right? They do not correlate. And so what happens is in organizations that tried this simple explore, exploit, is what do you do when you've got innovation for the core business itself? Right. The core business itself needs some kind of change, or you see some opportunity to do something really different. We're going to change the user journeys, the experience, create some new service, et cetera. But it's tied up in the core business, in the operations. You're using the physical retail stores as part of a new hybrid digital online offline model or something, or any example like that. It cannot be totally separated from the core business, right? And so what happened is you got all these companies where the core business had a digital innovation or any kind of innovation need, and they handed it off to some team somewhere else who's the innovation people, right? And so what do? They go work on it without the direct day-to-day involvement of the core business, and they come up with a solution, and it never works, and it is always rejected. And we have these metaphors of the antibodies and so forth. It comes back, and there's often it's not just not invented here, and it's not just hurt feelings. It's very often, well, that doesn't fit with our technology, integrate with our IT, or it doesn't match our regulatory requirements, or there are lots of reasons why these innovations come back and they fail to be taken up. But you cannot solve this unless you involve the people who are in the core business themselves as part of that team. Now, you can't just tell the main core team whose job is keeping the lights on and running the day-to-day business, oh, also reinvent this, right? Because that's too much split focus. So you need a different model. So I talked about what I saw. This is not something I invented. This is something that I saw in the companies that managed to break this cycle. Is that they were actually doing three different things, three different kinds of innovation, or three different, models or approaches to managing it. And I talk about them as paths. Path one is kind of classic iterative innovation in the core. There are things you got to do day to day that are like continuous improvement and tool quality management, things like that, where, again, you've got pretty low uncertainty, well-defined problems. The core business should do it, right? And it runs out of this even goes not just people, but resourcing. What budget does it run out of and so forth. Then you've got what I call path two. And these are innovations that can't be done without the core. They will never succeed without the help and without the buy-in or without the integration of the core business, but there's higher uncertainty. So you need a very different approach. And what you need there is this kind of hybrid model where you've got an established team and process and structure that's going to talk about this in length. How do you establish teams that know how to run rapid experimentation in whatever industry or context you're in, and apply all of these kinds of methods that came out of lean startup and agile and design thinking and product management and so forth. You got to have those teams, but they have to have embedded in them people from the core business, right? You got to have these embedded people. They've got to be not giving requirements. They have to be part of the team throughout the whole development process, right? And then there's the third path, which is everybody loves them, but for most companies, it's not your biggest growth opportunity, those innovation opportunities that are outside of your core business. Let's launch a totally different business model. Let's go after a new customer segment, something that really can be run separate, right? Classic example being like the birth of Amazon Web Services. A retailer decides to go into, cloud computing, right? Yeah, they literally sent, 2 or 3 guys off to South Africa, about as far from Seattle as you can get, for a year to see if you can come up with the first commercial product and see if you can get a customer to buy it, right? You really can't separate those activities and run them in this kind of model. But it's that misunderstanding of how do you set teams up for success that came out of so much of the practical implication of this explore, exploit concept that I saw has caused just a lot of innovation failure in many, many large companies.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about the 4 religions of iterative innovation, right? And I've always, in a lot of the teaching that I do, emphasizing all of these, right? Whether it's agile development or lean startup or, design thinking and so forth. But, it seems like, why do we still have to teach this stuff, right? Why isn't this core to management instruction, right? Like, we still have these studies that show that MBAs, fail at, iterative innovation. I mean, do we need to like completely reinvent the MBA, right? And so that this stuff is at the very start. I mean, what is it about management and that leads to this, planning or, the business as usual approach that you described? I mean, it seems like there's just like this tendency to push managers in that direction.
Yeah. I mean, I think it is. Certainly we're at a point where it's you say, here's what you need to do. And people are like, oh yeah, I've heard this a dozen times, right? Nobody's like, what is design thinking? I've never heard this term. What is agile, right? Everybody's kind of familiar. And a lot of companies I still have these kind of misconceptions like, well, we can't do that because X, we're this kind of company and that and so forth. And that partly has to do with I would say the limitations of each of these kinds of schools of thought, just because of where they arose. So agile, although the principles can be applied in lots of ways, it did arise out of software development. And so it's possible to follow what appears to be the agile, a lot of companies do this. They try to follow the process and the mechanisms of agile, but not really the mindset.
Too rigorous, too limited of a notion of what it means.
It just becomes another way of a bunch of engineers sitting around talking to each other. And to me, one of the most important principles is the team can't be a bunch of software engineers, right? That's one of the most foundational principles. So, you've got to learn from agile as a software development kind of historical method, but also look outside of that context. Same thing with lean startup. Brilliant, essential, critical principles I learned, working alongside Steve Blank, Bob Dorff. But they came out of the startup world. And, sometimes when you hear it stated in like their language and you say, yeah, but I'm a beer company and like we have like millions of customers and these are products, it's not a software app. We can't just, flip the MVP every, 24 hours or something like that. And it's like, how do I do this? So there's kind of like friction. I mean, I think that's part of it, which is what I've tried to, that's the part of the problem that I've tried to address, is try to say, hey, how do we actually unearth the kind of underlying ideas or the common threads across these methods and see how, if we abstract them a bit, but then give them some structure. So it's not just principles, but it's actually kind of a repeatable process, how you can do this even if you are a big company and whatever industry you're in. But the other thing is, I don't know it's so much education. Yes, I would love it to be first semester of the MBA. I mean, I think it is becoming institutionalized in MBA programs. We could maybe do a little better job, I would say. But I think there's also just the fact that, again, it's that, rewarding for A and hoping for B. You have organizations that are set up and the teams are still, people are not rewarded for intelligent failure. Teams are not given problems to solve. They're given tasks to execute and deliverables to deliver. And if you're giving people the wrong mandate, what it is that they are supposed to do, there's the famous quote by Upton Sinclair, it's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it, right? And that's the case inside a lot of organizations. It's set up, your salary depends on you not thinking in the way that these, design thinking, lean startup, and so forth, agile, product management, the way that kind of thinking is.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I was doing with the Digital Transformation Initiative I was just involved in with this company was, teaching them how to, run experiments. And, when we were asking all the people in the organization, the high-level people, to come up with ideas for how to improve the business, I mean, they all came up with these massive ideas, like, oh, let's just completely change the way we, lay fiber, or, oh, let's come up with this, massive anti-churn program. And, when I told them, look, you need to come up with a $10,000 experiment to find out whether or not what you're proposing is a good idea. I mean, they were like, what? Like, how do we do that? I mean, why is it, first of all, that experimentation like that isn't sort of bread and butter for everybody? And secondly, why is it that the CFOs, I mean, is it the CFOs, you think, that are kind of the ones that push people away from this type of thinking?
I mean, part of it. I think one of the key things when I talk about governance in the book and how do you create context for teams to work this way, you got to do sort of two things. At the team level, at the individual and team level, you actually have to train the teams in the methods, right? And you got to get practice. And it's great to you want to be coached. You want to start out with a team that's got some people who've done this before and others who haven't. It is something you learn not just in the classroom. You got to learn it through practice and through doing it. But it also matters, you've got to apply things like a different funding model, right? And so that's where the CFO comes in. It's a real shift in thinking. That's why it's hard. I talk about it, learning to think like a scientist. So instead of writing business plans, what you are writing is business hypotheses, right? So you start that example you just gave. The telco company comes with this big idea. What if we did, instead of fiber, we did this, or we did some totally different, way of distributing or laying the fiber or something like that. So you've got a problem statement. First of all, you got to understand what problem you're solving first, because a lot of times they just start coming up with solutions. Humans tend to, it's kind of a natural thing, fall in love with a solution. What you need to do is fall in love with the problem. So really, and it's okay. I don't beat people up if they walk in the door with, I've got an idea for this great innovation. But I say, before we go any further, we've got to define what is the actual problem we believe this would solve. Like, why would we do this? Okay. If you've got that clarity, if you've got the clarity of the problem you're solving for, then you may say, great, this is one possible solution. You want to then also come up with different possible solutions. And then you want to think about not putting a giant bet after a long on one solution. And if you're going to do that, that's high risk, right? It's not going to work. If it's high likelihood not to work, you can sort of feel that in your bones. You're apprehensive. It seems really expensive. And so you say, well, we need let's write this whole business case. So you just follow down the slippery slope into the old classic traditional planning process. Instead, you need to say, look, we know this problem matters, right? We know if we can solve this problem, that's good, right? We don't know how we're going to get there. We've got some different ideas. One of them might work. Multiple solution ideas we have might help get us there. Maybe none of them will work and we'll have to come back for another set of ideas, right? Going in with that mindset, but then what do you do? And what I talking about thinking like a scientist rather than a business planner is you write your hypotheses. You say, that's what a solution is at this stage before you do any experimentation. It's not a plan. You are not writing business plan, you're writing hypothesis. My hypothesis is that if we, presented this offer to the market, it would really resonate with this kind of customer and they would use it this way and it would grow. My hypothesis is if we, changed our operations of how we outsource a certain, part of the supply chain, that's going to reduce costs, produce cost savings, whatever it's a hypothesis, right? And I've got some tools in my books I developed working, but, there are different ways you need to spell that out, decompose that. Because a solution is based on a bunch of assumptions, right? Who's the market? What's the problem you're solving for? What are their unmet needs? What are the other options that you are, without realizing it, competing against? And sometimes the option is just do nothing, right? But there's always something in the mind of the customer or the user that they could do otherwise. Lots of companies spend lots of money coming in, building great new digital data analytics tools. And then they find the department that was supposed to use it, they build it really well. But the department was supposed to use it, you check in on them 6 months later, and they're all still using Excel. Right. And that's the fundamental problem. They didn't actually solve for a customer. They fell in love with a solution. So you figure out what are all these different unknowns. Well, this would work if all these various things. Then you're bringing in things like fixed and variable costs, potentially revenue model or cost savings, all the different things that would need to be true for this, to work out the way you hope. And then what scientists do is they do not gather data to prove themselves right. That's what business planners do. That's what people writing business cases do. Instead, you design experiments to prove yourself wrong. That is the whole essence of scientific experimental design. You create an experiment that could disconfirm your hypothesis, and then you run those experiments, right? So you've got to adopt a different way of thinking and learn how to kind of put that in practice. This idea of like coming up with taking one idea and turning it into a lot of business model hypotheses. And then one of the things I've worked with is how to help teams so that you actually wind up typically with dozens of like lots of unknowns and hypotheses. You can't test them all at once, right? Then the only way you can test them all at once is to build the entire thing. And then you kind of lost the whole point of speed and reduce cost. So how do you figure out, it's not about building a fraction of a product in many cases. It's about picking one or two of those unknowns or these hypotheses you have and creating an experiment just to validate that. right? Just to test that. And once people do that a few times, they start to see, okay, I know how to go from a big whatever product technology idea to some initial experiments that can start to validate it, very quickly and at low cost. And then you just need to put the whole governance architecture in place for the team to support the team in doing that, and really to support not just one team, but to go, it's not a startup, you're in a big company. So how do we actually have multiple teams doing that at the same time? And how do we shuttle around and move around resources between them in a intelligent fashion?
Well, look, I mean, that whole chapter, uncertainty reduction, and about sequential financing and how you move from, spend to learn to spend to earn. I mean, this is just a venture capital playbook, right? And so
exactly, that's another thing. The VC playbook is like agile, or lean startup. You just have to translate it. You got to take it out of the context. Everyone a lot of people see, oh, that works for VCs, but how would I do that inside a company that's got to hit its quarterly earnings, quarter by quarter, and is concerned about EBITDA and so forth? It can
I was
be
wondering,
done.
but why is it that, I mean, I know a lot of venture capitalists, and yet I don't know any of them that are being recruited by big companies to work in-house. Like they'll recruit from BCG, they'll recruit from, but very
Huge
few.
oversight.
Yeah, because they have this playbook down. It would seem like, let's, fire the CFO, bring in like a GP.
Yeah, one of the things that I really wish more people would sort of put into practice from my advice is about, who manages these teams and who allocates the resources. You need a board, what I call, generically an innovation board. So it's a group. You don't want a one-to-one decision, one person making decisions. There's lots of psychological dynamics why that fails. But a lot of companies do that, but they just get a bunch of people who are at the company and have been there for a long time. And it's like the composition is so critical. You want to have people who are new to the company. You want to have people with different industry experience, different career experience. And I always tell them, this is the thing almost nobody ever takes me up on. I say, just put one person on the team who's not an employee, who doesn't work at the company. It's a contract gig for them. They will not worry about getting fired. They'll just say what they actually think. And that's exactly where
they're not worried about getting promoted, right? They're not worried about
getting promoted. It's just like, hey, it's my thing. I'm going to tell you what I really think, the way I see it. Bring in some VC talent there. That's such a perfect role. Bring in someone who is even still a current working VC, sit on that innovation board and bring their lens to saying, do we keep investing in this bet, or is it time to shut it down, or say, you got to do a radical pivot before we give you another dime because you've just proven one of your core hypotheses?
That is a great idea. And I don't know why that hasn't been taken up. I'm going to start, recommending that as well. One other question I have for you is, the role of IT. So, in traditional organizations, you've got this cost center, the IT folks, and, they live in the basement and so forth. And then, digital transformation comes along, and now all of a sudden IT is more important, but it's still, considered the place where, you go and you come in with your ticket and you expect them to. I just did another project with a big chemical company about how to implement AI, and they still had this idea. I mean, they're very enthusiastic about implementing AI solutions, but they still have this idea that the business units will come to them and say, oh, we need to automate X, and can you design a solution for us? And then, push it back out to us when you're done. And I told the CIO, I was like,
throw
look,
it over the wall.
Yeah. I was like, I told the CIO, I was like, no, look, you need to reconfigure your role. Everybody in the company is now part of IT, right? So why?
As a CIO who I'm close with said, he hates the term IT. Whenever people say IT, he said, no, you need engineering. We've got engineers and the engineering talent, and I'm putting them on solving business problems. Like, this is not because that term has been associated with a role that the technology function had for many years in companies, in which you can't run it that way anymore. You're right. It has to be, what you need is teams that are, in most cases, multifunctional. That it is not just, it is a hybrid of engineering and other roles, and you are putting them together. They are problem defined, right? They are not defined about maintaining a certain, a process ongoing in the company. They're defined, tasked with solving a persistent problem. Right. How do we get better and better at X? That is something that really matters to the value of the company, as an example of this. So, it requires a restructuring, a different thinking. Then IT, you get rid of the old IT as a cost center, right? It's a big organizational shift. It's maybe in some cases for some a cultural shift. I find typically the people who are the technical experts, the engineers, the IT architects, and so forth, they all get it. They all want to work in that way, right? Agile is not a new thing for them. That just heard about, right? They're so yeah, but you've got to. The organization has, as a whole, has to recognize this is no longer a department that we ship requests to, and they ship us back, software, and then we do something with it.
Yeah, I mean, if they don't figure that out, then you're just going to have like 10,000 shadow IT departments right throughout the organization. Right?
Yeah, and there are real, it's a large organization. There are real issues, about security and threats and data privacy and cybersecurity. I mean, you want to distribute the development capabilities of the organization. You don't want everything going through a centralized bottleneck, but you also do need to have some oversight. You do need to have technology leadership who are setting parameters and guidelines and sandboxes and so forth, and seeing how all of this kind of fits together from a technical perspective. So you gotta bring that both together.
Yeah, I don't know if you saw this, but Moderna combined their IT and their HR departments recently. And
interesting. I had not seen that.
Yeah, because their idea
that means
is
you're really putting digital or technology talent at the center. You say, well, this is what we need to hire. Hire more of, or don't hire without thinking about this.
Yeah, I mean, I think their idea was that every job is really going to be like like a centaur job, right? Where it's a human and an agent, like kind of working together and so forth. So, do you think we'll ever stop talking about digital transformation? Can we just, will there be a time where we can just sort of retire the term and be done with it?
I'm not that attached to terms. I have become a bit of a stuck on the habit of defining my terms, because I find the biggest problem I have is that people get into debates about like whether or not something is a good thing or not, or helpful. MVPs, well, that's, we can't do that because of X, or that's bad, or digital transformation, blah, blah. And I said, well, what do you mean? Like, here's what I mean by this term. So I think, we may or may not be using that phrase, I don't know, in 20 years or something. But to me, the question of digital transformation, it is not, as kind of you set it up at the beginning, it's not about bolting technology onto an existing company. It is about how do we adapt an organization so that it can thrive in a digital context, right? The digital is actually about the context, not about what you're doing even necessarily per se inside the business. And to me, the most defining characteristic of the digital era is this accelerating change and accelerating or growing uncertainty that organizations have to cope with. I don't think that is going to change, right? I don't think that threat is going to change. So yeah, we can put some different language around it and so forth, but I think thinking through that challenge is going to be with us for some time to come.
Yeah, I mean, I remember at Wharton in the 90s, they created a separate department, called digital marketing, right? And you could get your own major in digital marketing. And after a couple of years, they're like, this just blended in with marketing, right?
Right.
And
why do we have a marketing department other than the digital marketing department?
Right.
Yeah.
And I noticed now that Wharton actually created like an AI major, and you can do this. And I think that's probably going to disappear.
It went very quickly from me being this kind of recalcitrant contrarian that I did not want to agree with every argument that everything is now AI and digital is now AI and AI this and AI that. And I would say, look, AI, first of all, AI didn't start in 2023. This is like something that's been building as a field for decades, but, really in practice for over a decade. Yes, we've got some incredible new models, and different approaches in the transformer models are important, and they're going to lead to new things. They're going to catalyze more stuff, and you got to be focused on it, thinking about it. But I always said, to me, this is, again, digital transformation is responding to all these waves of change. Each one is leading to the next. Predictive machine learning, 10, 12, 14 years ago led to other things. And then intervening technologies. And now we have large language models, and they're going to lead to, everyone's agents. Agents is this radical thing we've never seen. If you actually look at technical papers on how AI agents would work, and really it is a would, we're not really seeing this applied yet, significantly in practice. It's basically modular architecture. It's like APIs, and you're just in your individual software modules. Many of them have an LLM that they're calling on as part of the sort of reasoning process. I mean, that's great, and that may unlock lots of value. But, we get kind of caught up in all of this. And, what's interesting is very quickly from being like, I am not jumping on the Gen AI train, that everything is, we need a Gen AI strategy, hoo-yah. All of a sudden, like, nobody pushes back on that to me. In fact, now I say that to companies, and it's just kind of like, yawn. It's like, well, yeah, of course, that was just like crazy hype we were all swept up in for 12 months. And yeah, it does have to start with a business strategy. And of course, it has to start with a problem to solve. And of course, LLMs are one of the powerful tools we should look at, but we should start with a problem and then figure out which tools are going to work. And yeah, I guess I am starting to get a sense that even when LLMs are helpful, it's mostly because you're connecting it to other kinds of technologies and other kinds of data. It's not sort of this magical silver bullet. So I think, people are learning pretty fast.
Yeah, I remember I was asked to give a talk a couple months ago, and they said, what do you want to give a talk on? I was like, well, maybe we could talk about modularity and APIs and stuff like that. And they're like, oh no, that's so yesterday. Can you talk about AI? And I was like, well, do you think they're going to be able to roll this thing out if they haven't, figured out how to, modularize, like,
Yeah, you now have companies, they're still dealing with legacy on-prem, data centers, and they're like, oh, I want to use generative AI. It's like, yeah, that's not going to work. The time has come to pay the technical debt, pay the tax man, so to speak, if you want to start using any of these new technologies.
Well, I teach a core strategy course and I teach a digital strategy course, and I'm hoping one day I'll just fold everything into the strategy course and be done with it. So those
great.
days will hope. Yeah. Well, thanks so much for joining me, David. The course that you teach over at Columbia, the executive course, is on digital transformation. That's still going strong, I imagine. And so definitely check out these books about digital transformation. And of course, if you have time, definitely go check out the course. I've heard great things about it.
Thank you. We've got great, really fascinating, business leaders from all over the world who come for that program. It's called Leading Digital Transformation on campus. And I also have a Substack newsletter. This is a fun way to keep in touch. I try to share, with former students and just people around the world what I'm working on. But, thanks so much for having me on, Greg.
Okay. Well, we'll talk again soon, maybe out here.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.